Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Science and Technology Q&A for kids and others. I am not in my natural habitat today. I'm off, I don't know whether I'm gonna call it a vacation. It's a change of scenery, at least for me. I've been working hard all day, as I have been for the whole week, so I'm not sure it's most people's definition of a vacation, but at least change of scenery. All right, we have a bunch of questions here. And question here from Alan. Why are there still mysteries in our knowledge of the human body in spite of exponential advancement of our understanding in general? Look, I think the main thing to understand about biomedicine, biology in general, is that we are kind of the sole known example of molecular scale computing. It's like you look at a, we're sort of as sophisticated as lots of kinds of computational systems that we've built, operating systems, other kinds of things, but we're operating on a molecular scale. And it's, even though we can measure many kinds of things, we don't yet really know how to measure what's going on at that kind of molecular scale. And I think my own guess is that there are some sort of big principles about how biology works that have to do with essentially that have to do with things about how computation can work at this level of molecules that we don't yet know. And that's one of the sort of big things that's held us back. I mean, back in, I don't know what it was, 70 years ago now or so, the big breakthrough in biology was realizing how DNA worked. And the fact that DNA stored this kind of digital data of just a series of A, G, C, and T bits, effectively, that represent the way that one makes protein molecules, etc., and the way that one puts together the things that make up us as living systems. Before that time, people had not really had any idea how the specification of a living system was given, but then it became clear. But now there are sort of many things we don't understand about sort of the general architecture of how living processes of life really happen. We know some level of description, but we don't know it. We don't really understand sort of we can say things about this particular molecule does this, or this sequence of molecules have this particular cycle of behavior. But to know sort of at a bigger level what's going on, we don't really have a great sort of method of description for that. And I think that's one of the things that's made it hard to sort of really nail a lot of biomedical kinds of things, is for that reason. The other thing that's difficult is when we want to interface with us as biological organisms. Well, there's some things we can do at a very large scale. We break a bone, we can just sort of put some kind of cast on the bone or something to keep it sort of oriented in the right direction. But if we want to do something at a much finer scale that really plugs into the molecular scale level at which life really works, that's a much more difficult thing. And the only real thing we've been able to do with any serious degree of molecular success, so to speak, is drugs. And drugs are themselves just molecules which tend to be set up to just attach themselves to a particular shape of molecule that occurs somewhere in our bodies, and then to change the characteristics of that molecule, block its action, enhance its action, whatever else. And so that's sort of our one mechanism for doing things on a molecular scale, is just you put in these drug molecules, and they are sort of fit puzzle piece like with some particular kind of molecule protein in our bodies typically, and that's sort of our mechanism for interfacing with us as biological organisms. But those are very sort of, they're not deep mechanisms for interfacing with us. I mean, in recent times with gene editing, for example, we have another sort of method of interface, which is, change the genetic sequence of cells, just something that's beginning to be something clinically possible. But I think there's a lot more to be understood about sort of the interface between things that we make technologically and things that are at the sort of molecular scale that exist in us as biological organisms. And it's kind of as we think about nanotechnology, making things on molecular scales that are like machines, one place where that's really important is in making sort of machine-like things that can interface with the kind of molecular structure that is what we have as biological organisms. So I think those are some things that, and sort of our failure to understand sort of the big picture of how to describe molecular scale computing is one of the things that's held back progress in biomedical kinds of areas. And similarly, our inability, we can have a sensor that measures the level of some specific chemical in our blood, for example, but to know kind of what, let's say, for example, let's say in our immune system, classic example, we can, in our immune system, there might be 100 billion different kinds of antibodies. And for any particular kind of, let's say, virus, we might develop some collection of antibodies to that virus. We can go in and say, how many antibodies of this type out of these 100 billion possible, how many of that particular type of antibody do we have? Great, we can make an assay that will measure that particular thing. But if what really matters in the immune system is some dynamic network of this antibody cell affects this one, we don't have a way to measure that kind of dynamic network of interactions between those cells. But that may in fact be the thing that if we want to sort of, quotes, understand how the immune system is working, that may be the important thing to understand, not just how many of a particular antibody do we have. And so that's an example where if we had sort of a real molecular scale, real understanding of molecular scale computing and real sort of understanding of how to make nanotechnological devices, we might have a real chance to be able to sort of plug into that dynamic network and understand what was going on in it. So I think it's kind of what I expect to have happen over the next many decades, probably, in the development of biomedicine. There'll probably be some moment, maybe we'll even get to it fairly soon, where there'll be a serious jump in understanding where there'll be sort of a new narrative, a new paradigm for talking about molecular biological processes, just as there was a new paradigm when the idea of genetic information in DNA was discovered in 1953. Let's see. Question here from Aaron. What are the approximate odds that two people have the same fingerprint? Odds of a collision among all fingerprints within the enumeration of the parameter space of fingerprint patterns. Well, we all have somewhat unique little folds of skin on our fingers. And the way that those are formed is when one is an embryo, things are growing, but the things that form one's fingers, there's a folding of pieces of tissue, and those folds are then visible in what you get in your fingers. Now, I think actually the way that our hands form, they're initially a sort of flat plate of cells, and then the cells in between our fingers die off. I mean, we would have webbed hands were it not for the fact that sometime in the development of us as embryos, the cells that are in between our fingers are programmed to die off so that we have separated fingers. And somewhere in the process of that, and I'm not exactly sure how it works, there is folding of material that then gets sort of cut off, and that's what leads to our fingerprints. And we have lots of things have sort of fingerprint-like patterns. Zebras have sort of fingerprintish patterns that in their stripes. And if you look at our brains, things like the particular way in which the nerves from our left and right eyes, the optic nerve fibers from our left and right eyes, sort of connect to the visual cortex at the back of our head, again, makes a sort of a zebra stripe-like pattern that is sort of a little bit like fingerprint pattern. And we've got other things on us, like our ear pattern is also a folded pattern. Inside our brain, brains are typically a sort of a sheet of material, and they get kind of folded up to fit inside a skull. And that again has a sort of folding pattern that's a bit fingerprint-like. But the details of how fingerprints form seem to depend a lot on the particular environment that some particular fetus is in. So, for example, if you have two identical twins, a reasonable question is, do they have the same fingerprints? And the answer is no, they don't. Although some of the features that they have, like do they have many whorls, which are these kind of loop-like things? No, they're what is a whorl? I think those are the loop-like things you see in your fingerprints. Do they? Whether you have many of those or few of those, that's genetically determined. But the particular pattern of them is not genetically determined. It will be different between identical twins. I think the reason that your two hands have similar fingerprints is because they were formed actually touching together. So it's not that they were sort of separately programmed to have that form, it's that they were actually physically attached when those particular folds were formed. Although I have to admit that doesn't explain the folding pattern in ears, which do tend to be the same on both sides. I don't actually know how those work. Good question. Because one would think that something sort of a complicated pattern like that would be, it's surprising that they are formed in the same way, even though they're sort of independently formed. They seem random, so to speak, but they're obviously not, they have the same randomness, so to speak, on the two sides. Well, when it comes to biometrics, having your computer recognize you, so to speak, there are a whole variety of different things. And for a while, fingerprint readers were really pretty common. Now it tends to be more face readers. And I think face readers tend to be quite sensitive to things like the placement of ears and things like that. It's not just facial expression, and even if you're wearing sunglasses, it can often correctly identify you versus somebody else. And usually there's a trade-off between the possibility of a misidentification, there could be somebody who's emulating you, versus the possibility that you not be recognized, so to speak. And there are different, there are sort of, or the ease with which the recognition happens. I mean, one of the things that has been done on many devices is to have the actual recognition process be local to the device. So no data ever has to be sent to a central server to do like face recognition. All that information about the shape of your face is all stored locally on the device. And that's sort of a safer way to do it. But then there's sort of a limit to how sophisticated sometimes the sort of computation that's done to figure out whether it's a match is. And sometimes people have very major sort of examples of that, like there were a family of credit cards that I don't know if they were ever put into production in the US. I think they have been put into production in some other countries. There were fingerprint reading credit cards where you would hold the credit card, and the credit card, when you swipe it over something, gets just a tiny amount of electrical power from sort of the induction effect from the device that you're swiping it over. And the idea was to have enough electrical power to drive a tiny electric circuit that would be sophisticated enough that it could pick up enough features of your fingerprint that it could know with reasonable certainty that it was you that had your finger on the credit card. And so that's an example where because you want it to be done with low power and with just the tiny amount of circuitry you can fit in a credit card, you don't want to go quite as sophisticated in terms of what you're measuring. But in a sense, it's just an extra piece of protection in terms of knowing that it's really you who has the credit card and so on. Let's see, there's a comment here from Luis about fingerprints, the two-dimensional fingerprints being reminiscent of the inversion that occurs in the body. I think maybe you're referring to the process of gastrulation, which is one of the more bizarre things that works in biology. I mean, we all start from a single cell, and the cell starts replicating. It starts doubling. I think it doubles every few hours initially. I think that's right. In bacteria, it's like 10, 20 minutes, but we have cells with much more DNA to replicate and so on. Maybe it takes a day or two for our cells to replicate like that. But in any case, what happens is one cell turns into two, each of those cells turns into two cells, so then you've got 4 cells and 8 cells and so on. And for a while, we're just growing, doubling every day or whatever it is. And the cells that make up the very early us just form this ball of cells, and every cell is just it just splits in two, and then those cells grow, and then they split in two. You get this thing that's usually called the blastula, which is this spherical blob of cells. And one of the things that happens is at some moment, I forget how long it takes, maybe a week or something after the beginning, that you've got a decent number of cells, maybe it's as much as 1 million cells, I'm not sure, of that order perhaps, and it's in a big blob. And then what happens is this very bizarre phenomenon where there is one piece of the blob ends up sort of being the head piece, another piece ends up being the tail piece, and there's this bizarre thing that happens where the thing essentially forms itself, goes from a sphere into a kind of a shell and a torus, actually, kind of a donut, a tube, a cylinder with a hole in the middle. And that happens by some of those cells kind of getting pulled probably by little fibers to the other side of this sphere of cells, and they kind of get pulled through the sphere, and the sphere kind of inverts itself and ends up being this kind of tube-like thing. And that tube-like thing is what eventually will form us. And, you know, one part of it forms the head, one part of it forms the sort of the other end of us, and we are ultimately a tube where, you know, we eat things and they go through the inside of us and so on. And that's kind of what that tube turns into. And so that process of gastrulation, of going from the sphere to the kind of tube, is a very bizarre kind of geometrical biological process, which is a critical feature of the formation of any of the higher organisms, so to speak. And it's a feature that presumably was discovered a couple of billion years ago in the history of life on Earth, but it's something that sort of all organisms go through, and that all higher organisms go through in their formation. Okay, another biology question, and then we'll turn to some other things. D0 asks, is there a way to make trees grow faster? Well, yeah, there is. You know, we humans have this thing, human growth hormone, secreted by the pituitary gland inside our brain, and that is it's a hormone, a substance that kind of goes throughout our body, stimulating growth. And when we're young, so to speak, kids, there's lots of human growth hormone, and it is stimulating the growth of our cells. Very bizarrely, the human growth hormone tends to be, the gland that produces it tends to produce pulses of human growth hormone, like once a day or something. And so they're a very bizarre thing that I think people, you know, you say, I'm growing, and I'm growing by some number of inches per year or whatever. Turns out you grow in little jumps at night, not sort of continuously through the day, because of this pulsatile release of human growth hormone, at least so it's claimed. But so humans have this hormone that sort of stimulates growth of cells. Plants also have that kind of thing. They're called auxins, AUXIN, and they're a type of they're rather small molecules that can diffuse through the tissues of a plant, and that sort of give a signal to plant cells to divide. Plants only tend to divide at a particular place. There are these things called apical meristems, which are just these special cells that are the dividing parts of plants. Mostly a plant, once it's formed a piece of the trunk is just going to sit there. It's a rigid thing with cellulose cell walls, but it has a little place where it kind of where there is cell division, and where it adds more pieces and maybe branches and so on. And you can get plants to grow faster by feeding them plant auxins. And in fact, the fact that plants grow their shoots in the directions they do comes about because of the diffusion of auxins inside the plant, and among other things, but that's the main effect. So yeah, I think that people who do, you know, tree surgery and so on, and I think you can get trees to grow in particular directions by injecting plant auxins in the right places and so on. So yes, I think there is a way to do that. I don't know whether, if you kind of sort of supercharge a plant and say grow faster, 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 I don't know whether that works very well. I don't think I think tends to be the case that biology sort of has, you know, you can pull out the stops and make a biological system do something sort of special, but then it does it less well than when it's doing it in its usual way. So I wouldn't be surprised that that's what would happen, that you'd get the tree would grow taller, but it wouldn't be quite as strong or some such other thing. Okay. Let's see. RBS says, if there exists a machine code for our bodies, is the model one's working on some kind of debugger. Could you explain the things you expect to be predictable within a theory? Well, no, I don't really know yet. I mean, really what we're trying to do is to have a way to give an overall description of what's happening in a biological system in the same way that we can say, oh, there's genetics and we have a genetic code, and you know, there's a certain operation of the way that organisms form based on that genetic code, and we can say that organisms pass sort of information from one generation to the next through the genetic code and so on. I think the question of sort of the large-scale organization of biological systems is a bit analogous to the large-scale organization of computer systems. Like, you've got an operating system and it's got, you know, millions and millions of lines of code. It's got little pieces that do particular things. You know, there's something controls the memory subsystem. There's something that controls the display. There's something that deals with keyboard input, all those kinds of things. Those modules of the operating system are quite analogous to the kinds of things that we have in our biological existence. You know, we have our heart pumping blood around our bodies and things. You know, the operating system has, you know, something distributing, you know, deciding what process is going to run next in your computer, things like this. There are these definite sort of organs, in a sense, where in our physical bodies, those organs tend to be laid out spatially, like, you know, our heart is in one place, our kidneys are in other places, etc. But in the case of a computational system, a computer system, it tends to be more that there's a piece of code that represents doing this thing, a piece of code that represents doing that thing. Those pieces of code in the memory of the computer might happen to be laid out in different places, but that's kind of the layout in the memory of the computer is sort of almost as irrelevant as the layout of our genetic information on our genome. Like, the fact that the gene for eye color is or isn't close to the gene for foot size or something is really not relevant, it seems, in the operation of us as biological organisms. It's just they're all thrown in, all that information is thrown onto the genome in all sorts of different places, just as it probably doesn't matter whether the order of the source code for your operating system puts the display driver before the memory subsystem, for example. But this question then of so when you run the system and you've got your operating system, and it's running, it's doing all the things it does, it has the feature that, well, things can go wrong. There can be, you know, you can gradually have parts, you know, you can have parts of the system that are running just fine. You can have parts of the system that get some kind of horrible trauma as you plug some crazy device into the side of your computer and you give horrible trauma to the device drivers, those kinds of things. And that's, I think, quite analogous to what happens in biological systems, where we can have, you know, some trauma associated with some bad thing that happens to us as biological organisms. So I think there's quite an analogy between sort of this organized code that we have in an operating system and the sort of organized structure of biological organisms. But, and I think there's a piece to that picture that isn't quite right yet, because I think that when we talk about an operating system, we have a certain kind of organization for how the computations work that involves, so you give an input, it goes crunch, 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 and get an output. I think that's actually different from the way that one actually can, sort of things work in molecular computation. You know, it's a funny thing, when DNA was realized to be digital information, that was 1953, that was right around the time that the first computers were really coming online, and there was for the first time sort of a technological example of digital information. I think we'll probably understand sort of what's happening in biological systems sort of about the same time as we first begin to have molecular computers coming online as pieces of technology. We'll get some intuition for the way that sort of computations can happen, not in this mode of there's an input, crunch, 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 and a single output. But I think the this whole question about okay, so you're running the system and it has all these things happen to it. It gets this traumas, it does this, it does that. Eventually the operating system crashes. That's kind of like it, in fact, one often says of a computer, it dies. And that's very similar to what's happening in a biological organism when sort of nothing works anymore. And then, you know, you can restart your operating system from the same program. You can restart it just like you can perhaps restart, you know, you could have a cloned organism or a child organism with sort of mixed DNA, but a cloned organism with the same DNA. and you can imagine restarting it from the beginning again, and then it gets to run its life again, so to speak. Just like when you reboot a computer, it gets to run sort of its computational life again. So there's this question of, well, okay, so how would we debug, how do we debug a running operating system? It's actually pretty hard. And it's not something that is done that often. Usually you just say, look, if it's really messed up, just reboot it. That's kind of a shame for humans, because that just means, well, if this generation is really messed up, just let that one die and go on to the next generation. We like to feel that we're all unique enough that we'd like to keep us running, not just say, I'm kind of giving up and just going to let the next generation take over, so to speak. Although in the end, that's what has happened in the history of our species so far. I think that the question of what, how do you debug something like a biological system is kind of like, how do you debug a running operating system? And it's kind of hard, and we don't yet know a lot about how to do it. And it's often hard to, just like if we say, oh, there's that piece of memory in the operating system that looks like it's got goofy stuff in it, let's just surgically remove it, so to speak. Well, knowing the consequences of that is really hard, just like the corresponding thing with biological systems. Let's see. Prutz is commenting, so the conscious brain is like the user code space, and the unconscious like kernel space code. Perhaps something like that. I mean, I think that the notable thing about our sort of view of what we're thinking about in our brains is that we imagine there's this kind of single thread of experience. Something happened to me and then another thing happens to me and another thing. It's not like everything is happening and being thought at the same time. It's really a thread of thoughts, a sequential thread of thoughts. And I think the kind of the sort of the unconscious parts of the brain, which we are not sort of which we don't recognize are there, which we can't start talking about, so to speak, are probably those lots of things that are sort of running in parallel, and somehow there's a particular thread that gets picked out that is the part that is our actual experience of the sequence of thoughts we have. Let's see. There's a question here, comment here from Paul. How far away are we from finally doing away with physical smartphone screens and replacing them with virtual projected screens in front of the user, which can be made as big or small as one likes? I think the idea, I sort of had the idea at some point that, one should just work with the great big screen, the size of a wall in front of one. I've never actually tried doing that. I almost did that. I had a setup a few weeks ago, a place where I was for a couple of weeks. I had sort of an office set up where I did have a very big screen. I thought maybe I would do kind of the Zoom-like thing with a very big screen, so I'd be sort of always looking somewhere at the very big screen. I have to admit, I never actually turned it on, and I kept on just using my same old computer screen. So I don't actually know what the real experience of sort of trying to work sort of on a computer screen, where the computer screen is really this giant thing the size of a wall. I haven't tried it. I really should try it. The other technology is virtual reality or augmented reality glasses. Virtual reality, you're wearing this whole thing that is blocking your whole field of view and projecting sort of a virtual image. And one of the big issues there is when you turn your head, that image you have to be like seeing a different part of the virtual scene to emulate what you would get if you were physically turning your head in a room. And often there's some lag there, and people like me tend to get horribly motion sick from that. There's a lag, you turn your head, but the image hasn't quite moved fast enough. And so that really confuses your brain, and that shows up. The signal that we get in our brains is, I get nauseous, I get motion sick. That's sort of the signal that the brain is saying, hey, there was a lag here, didn't quite match up. So, the technology that's probably more interesting is augmented reality, where you're seeing through to the outside world, but you have something projected on sort of your glasses or whatever that is giving you some kind of display screen. And I think probably the most likely technology there is something that rather than that, I don't know, it may work in different ways. It's either some optics on the glasses that sort of projects an image in the right place in your eye, or possibly it's actually a little very low power laser that essentially scans very quickly across, into your eye, essentially painting the image line by line on your retina. But either one at the back of your eye. But either one of those is a possibility, and the result will be, that we can sort of see this sort of floating text in our visual scene. And there have been many experiments on this going back 20 years or more. There was a big burst of interest about 10 years ago now. People said, it's almost here, augmented reality is almost here. I think finally we're maybe a year or two away from having sort of a realistic, usable augmented reality system. And that will be something where one really has the possibility, maybe, I don't know, if it will end up being attractive to kind of have that be one's display screen. And I think that, part of the story there is, you have that display screen, but then what are you typing on? And, one difference between augmented reality and virtual reality is that augmented reality, you can still see your fingers. In virtual reality, where you can have sort of you can have a sort of a fake version of your fingers that comes from some sensor or camera that's looking at your actual fingers. But in the case of augmented reality, you can see your actual fingers because you can still see sort of the outside world. And I think that's sort of the next step there. I don't really know whether it's going to be a great thing or not. I mean, I think that, when I first saw Windows on computer screens, that must have been in 1979, 1980, visiting Xerox PARC, a research center in California where graphical user interfaces were basically invented. And I have to say, my initial reaction was, this is never going to work. Do you really want, I have messy piles of paper on my desk. Do I really want an emulation of messy piles of paper on my computer screen? And there were things like, look at this wonderful, cool feature where you can drag one file from one folder to another. And it's like, really? You really are going to do that? Well, what if one of the folders is obscured on your screen and you can't drag from here to there? That's just incredibly goofy. You should be able to move the file from this folder to that folder, even if the icons for the folder you're moving into happen to be obscured by some other window. That seems like way too emulating the real world with messy pieces of paper and so on. Well, it turns out I was wrong, because it turns out people do find it pretty intuitive to, for example, move files from here to there, even though you can be in this goofy situation. It happens to me every day where, the actual window, the part of the window that you want to move that file to happens to be obscured. So you can't move the file. You have to move the window out of the way and then move it. And so the question of what is actually intuitive to do, what do people find reasonably easy to do, and what not, is pretty hard for me, at least, to predict. And I don't know, when it comes to augmented reality and people seeing, the things one will no doubt have very quickly are kind of captioning of things in the world. Like, I could make some, funny hand motion, which is kind of my equivalent of a mouse click, and suddenly, everything in, suddenly I'm walking along the street and there's a plant there, and it'll have a little sign, a virtual sign in augmented reality that says that's a hibiscus plant or something. And it's like, okay, great. Or it might say, it's kind of like you just pass somebody on the street, or you're approaching somebody on the street, and the thing could come up and a little caption saying, you're connected to that person on LinkedIn, or you're two-level connected to that person on LinkedIn, or something like that. So I think that this idea that sort of there'll be immediate information about the world in augmented reality is something that will come. And I think it's sort of interesting because, I'm sort of old enough to remember before the web, and when you would like meet a person and you would know their name and you might know where they worked and so on, but it was very hard to find out much about that person. Whereas now you can kind of just go search on the web and you can quickly find all kinds of information about many, many people, and certainly more public people. And I think that's really a new thing. When there were people I knew back in the 1980s, for example, where I just didn't really know much about them, and where today I would immediately know tons about them. not because I'm going and sleuthing particularly, but just because when they send me mail, they put a URL of their homepage, and there it would be, all the information. Whereas in the past, it's like, well, you want to know about me, how are you going to find out? It's like if somebody was a professor in some department of some university, how do you find that out? Today you just go to the website for that university and you look it up. But back in the past, it was not such an easy thing to know. It was maybe you'd find some directory that was printed out and it was old and it was this and it was that, different kind of thing. So there was a certain lack of kind of immediate access to information. In the future, my guess is that there'll be immediate access to sort of in sort of the everyday world, things will get annotated sort of in a way that beyond what we have right now, where you can go look for the information, it'll be sort of preemptively annotated. A little bit like, when you're driving around with a GPS, things that you're preemptively told, this is such and such a street or something. And, exactly what consequences that will have and how we'll then think about, things like our user interfaces and so on, I don't completely know. I mean, I think there's some things that have changed very little. I mean, low-level programming languages, for example, and the way one programs in them has changed extremely little. The presence of the web and things like that hasn't really changed that much. I think the use of computer systems and sort of the fact that you can find documentation on the web and you're not just like, I don't know why it did that, and I don't have any way to tell other than by calling somebody in technical support, that's changed. Let's see, I'm noting here a comment about virtual reality, Serge commenting that an MIT group developed a thing for reading your mind so you don't need to type. Yeah, I've been waiting for that for 45 years. I've been waiting to be able to type by thought. Not here yet. I'd always been thinking when I was younger, I always thought, well, if all my hair falls out, at least I'll be able to more easily attach the electrodes to be able to type by thought. But I'm told it doesn't really make any difference. But being able to pick up signals in the premotor cortex and the top of your head, so to speak, where you start developing kind of the electrical signals that will eventually turn into the signals that go down your nerves to make your fingers type. You can, in principle, detect that. I mean, maybe it takes 0.3 seconds, 0.3 of a second, to sort of for you to decide I'm going to press that key. But probably after 1/10 of a second, there is significant nerve activity in your brain that's saying, hey, I'm probably going to type that key. I think you can still sort of stop yourself from doing it for another 1/10 of a second or so. So you can sort of talk of stream of consciousness typing. You can have a very literal stream of consciousness typing where you're picking up what you meant to type at the level where you first start developing, in a sense, forming the thought of typing that. And it's like, let's just, put out everything that is all the thoughts I've formed, even if I might have censored that thought, so to speak, before it actually came out as a thought. But yeah, you can imagine sort of type by thought type mechanisms. It's there's one level of it where you have electrodes on the outside of the skull that are trying to detect what's going on in your brain. There's a much more intrusive mechanism of you actually put electrodes into your brain, which sometimes you might do for medical reasons, like for dealing with Parkinson's disease or some such other thing. You might have anyway put electrodes into your brain, and then it's a question of can you use those to kind of read out what you're thinking at a more detailed level. Not yet known how to do that, but one can imagine that will eventually be possible. It will undoubtedly be the case that one person's sort of a neuron level thought pattern is completely different from everybody else's neuron level thought pattern. But one can expect that the machine that one connects will be able to learn what your particular thought pattern is. I mean, that's something people at least experiment with. If you break your spinal cord, that's what all the nerves that control your arms and legs and so on go through your spinal cord. And in principle, you can sort of reconnect pieces of that, or you can make an artificial thing that is moving legs or whatever else. But you need to know which fiber in the spinal cord is the fiber that is supposed to go to your, thumb on your left hand or some such other thing. And in principle, you can learn that by just thinking, oh, I'm going to think about moving my thumb. Okay, great. Then that particular fiber will start having activity, and then you can notice that's the fiber that has activity when you think about moving your thumb. I don't know. I haven't been in a situation of trying to do this. I have no idea quite how difficult it is to form the thought of moving your thumb without actually having your thumb to move, and that's a challenge there. Let's see. Someone here is making a suggestion about, I've talked about doing some interviews, and someone is making a suggestion of Ed Fredkin as an interviewee. And yes, I'd love to do that, but I think Ed is unfortunately was not perhaps not perhaps in the best condition for such an interview. I hope I could do that, and maybe I should try and see whether he has a good moment for doing that. Let's see. There's a question here from D0 about tablet PCs. Why didn't they take off in the 1990s, only much later? That's a good question. I mean, I certainly knew tablet PCs. I would say the real thing that made tablets take off was the iOS operating system, was the idea of a touch-based operating system. That really wasn't a thing. I mean, people were trying to run operating systems that have been developed for sort of traditional keyboard-based GUIs. And really, I think the great innovation of the iPhone was this idea, let's just rethink how a user interface is supposed to work based on the fact that we're just using our finger to do it. And I think that's the key innovation that had to happen for it to be really interesting to have sort of a tablet type PC, because otherwise it's just like a bad form factor of thing where you've got a keyboard on it and all kinds of other things like that. I think that's the main thing. I think Steve Jobs is probably the main person to whom to attribute that kind of push to get sort of a touch-based operating system. At least that's my feeling about the history there. Guil is asking, is typing and writing a bottleneck in productivity? I wonder if thought typing will have a significant effect on how much most people get done. I think I type a little bit faster. I type faster than I write. Certainly now, my writing has gotten very deeply atrophied. I think I seem to practically, the only thing I do is sign my name these days in terms of writing, and the occasional notes that I take. By the way, I have to make, this is one of these little pitches for something. I know that in celebration of the 20th anniversary of my book, A New Kind of Science, we're making this kind of box set of various books, including a new one about 20 years of A New Kind of Science. And one of the things that I perhaps foolishly signed up to do was to, we're making sort of a limited edition of this, and I foolishly signed up to sign and number all of the pieces of that limited edition. So I don't know, my hand may be falling off by the end of that, but that's something that I think is just now available to pre-order. So I might as well give the pitch for the boxed set of books, which will be an exercise in one of my few moments of handwriting in these years. But yeah, I think, I've sometimes thought about dictating things on the grounds that it's faster than typing things, but I have to say I type pretty fast. And I think that the extra kind of control that I get from typing something as opposed to just saying it probably increases the quality of the output by enough that it's worth it. It's a funny thing, back a long time ago, in the beginning of the 1980s, my very first company, I happened to be physically located, well, I was in Los Angeles, where there's lots of traffic, and I would often go there, and it was located a long traffic drive away, so to speak. And so I would be stuck in traffic and things, and I was very low tech in those days. I had a tape recorder, and I would record, letters, correspondence, memos, things like that. And somebody would type them out from the tapes. And it worked okay. It worked okay. I haven't done it since. I haven't done kind of verbal stuff since then. Now, it probably helped to have a human transcriber at that time. And obviously we could have a human transcriber again. We have plenty of stuff that is human transcribed, but it kind of feels like, oh, that's a terrible waste of time to be talking it and then have it separately transcribed. But maybe I should try it again. Maybe it would actually be an efficient thing to do. I tend to, when I'm driving around, and I tend to be one of these people who likes to drive themselves rather than be driven around. When I'm like driving or something, I will set up, some list of phone calls to make. And I think I could as well be dictating something, but actually it's a pretty good thing that there's certain kinds of phone calls that I don't get around to most of the time, but then I do when I'm driving. So that's actually a good way to not waste that time. But so this question of whether, if I could dictate rather than type, would that actually be productive? And my feeling is probably not, because as I say, just like if I could pick up the signals in my premotor area, 0.1 seconds earlier, there'd probably be a bunch of jumbled stuff there and it's much better to let it all sort of come all the way out to my fingers and type it. And then it's more likely to be what I want to commit to, so to speak. That's what I think, at least. I'm not sure. Not sure that's true, but I think, the other problem with transcription today is automated transcription is pretty good, but not perfect enough that you can just say, here it is, I don't need to read it again, off it goes, so to speak. Paul is saying that I guess for now we'll just have to keep getting excited every time someone comes up with yet another smartphone with a slightly bigger screen. One of the questions is, can you program on a smartphone? And we've done a bunch of experiments with Wolfram Language about having a good programming interface for a smartphone. And again, it's like other redefinitions of user interfaces, that the things you need to program a typical program on a very small screen with all kinds of auto-completion and so on are different from what you need where typing is easy and you've got a big screen. And I'm not sure that we've completely solved the problem of doing the best you can to program on a small screen, but it needs a bunch of new ideas, programming on a small screen. Just like dictating code would need a bunch of new ideas, or speaking code needs a bunch of new ideas. You don't just, if you say, map, open bracket, F, comma, list, blah, 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 it quickly becomes pretty incomprehensible to us humans. And there's no doubt a way to add fluff words in there and things to make it so that the spoken code is really something that we humans can understand, just like we can understand spoken human language, understand spoken computational language. This is interesting from RBS. I never thought of this. If someone falls asleep in front of their computer with the electrodes still in their heads and starts dreaming, will it type their dreams? Boy, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't know the answer to that. There's a certain amount one can do with functional MRI imaging where you're looking at the amount of blood flow in different parts of the brain and things like this to sort of tell what you're thinking about just externally by observing what part of the brain is sort of activated. And I don't know what that looks like if somebody is asleep in an fMRI scanner. I have a feeling that the dirty secret is that to really get results from one of those fMRI scanners, you have to do it sort of very repeatedly. You have to say, think of an apple, think of an orange, think of an apple, think of an orange. And you have to be sort of looking at repeated sort of trials of things rather than just like one shot, capture the movie of thoughts, so to speak. But it would be really an interesting thing, and certainly technologically not too far away to be able to pick up, in when dreaming, so to speak, what areas of the brain are being activated. And I don't even know whether the connection to the thread of attention that is the part that one might even have a chance of remembering about dreams, that sort of single thread of what you're paying attention to, whether that is the most active electrically part of the brain, or whether that's just something where there is some particular part of the brain that's associated with sort of connecting you to your kind of thread of experience, and what that connects to is what you remember, but it isn't necessarily the most electrically dramatic part of the brain. You could be, the parts of your brain that are involved, cats and dogs or something, could be very active, but all you remember is the peach or whatever, because somehow the part of your brain that's associated with that sort of thread of attention is connected to the peach, and there's other parts of your brain that are catting and dogging, so to speak, independent of that. I don't know. I'm a bad example of this because I typically never remember dreams, and I think this is one of these you never know what to conclude from medical data kinds of observations. One of the most bizarre things, I might have mentioned this before, when I got COVID vaccines, starting right after I got these vaccines, right after the first one, I started remembering dreams. And for decades, I've never remembered dreams. And it just seemed like such a strange thing. And it kept going for a few months and then just disappeared again. And I have, why there should be any connection between, you've got lipid nanoparticles and RNA vaccines and things, and anything to do with remembering dreams and brains, I haven't the slightest idea. And maybe it's purely coincidental, and maybe it was just a moment in my life or history or some other medical aspect that caused that to happen. But that's why it's so hard to conclude things often about medical stuff. It's like, I have one data point and it's really weird, but I don't know what it means. But so I'm usually a bad person for having much to say about dreams, because I don't really remember the ones that I have. Perhaps because I am one of these people who manages to live their life without basically pretty much ever using an alarm clock. And so that maybe the fact that I'm not sort of woken up in the middle of REM sleep or whatever, where I would be having dreams, is the reason I don't remember them. I don't know. I've not really made a good scientific study of that. But in any case, yeah, very, very weird thing. Okay, so Serge is commenting, if you drink milk before you go to sleep, you'll remember your dreams. Okay, it's an interesting claim. I'm not a big milk drinker, although I am a big milk chocolate eater, so who knows. Right, I think right, I mean, one thing I see people apparently commenting on solidifying thoughts by actually physically writing things and so on. I think one of the things, memories, the neurons in your brain, the synapses, the connections between neurons in your brain, they encode memories, but probably a lot of what we remember today is remembering things we remembered. That is, rather than that original time 50 years ago, 60 years ago, no, not 60, whenever, but I don't know, when, some disgusting number of years ago, when I first learnt, I don't know, some random fact about dinosaurs or something, I don't know whether that fact is something that the neuron, the synapse that encoded that fact back, half a century ago, is still alive and well and able to give me that fact again. I think it is more likely that when I retrieve that fact today, I am retrieving a memory of having remembered that fact in the past, that it's some kind of relay race type thing where the original memory is being re-remembered by you, and then you're re-remembering the re-remembering and so on, and it goes and kind of jumps like that. And possibly dreaming has something to do with this, because possibly that sort of rehearsing the sort of re-going through the things that you knew before, so you're then forming new memories that then keep going for longer, so to speak. And people have different mechanisms for remembering things. I mean, I think that some people are very visual. They can remember things purely visually. Some of them are much more based on the sound of things. I know I myself have. I don't know, I have a strange memory, but when I was a young kid, I used to be able to do the fun trick. If you look at a page, you look away and you read off the words on the page. And I'm not sure, I didn't realize that it wasn't the case that everybody could do that. And as soon as I realized at age 5 or something that everybody couldn't do that, I quickly started losing that capability. Although one of my kids has something close to that capability, actually, even in much older age. But it's a neat party trick. It's not clear it's useful for anything, but it's being able to have kind of an image-based memory where you can just remember the image without having kind of parsed out the image as words and so on. it's probably, again, it's a bit related to things like when you read words and you learn to read, do you sound out the words, or do you do sort of the whole word thing where you're just sort of ingesting the whole image of the word and recognizing what the word is? And I know when there's sort of a question of when you do that, do you actually read the whole word, or do you just get, if there was some letters jumbled up in the middle, would you even notice? And often one doesn't notice. I think, I'm pretty decent at proofreading things. And I think part of the reason for that is because I am one of these whole word type readers. And I think that the patterns that I have for words, they are specific patterns. And if the word has a different shape in the middle, it doesn't fit that pattern, and I'll notice that. In any case, I think let's see. Yeah, Gian is commenting about dreams and people who keep dream journals, and whether what you write in your dream journal is accurate. I tend to think that dreams are not made up at the moment when you wake up and remember them. I have to believe that there's a sort of a trace of what happened before, just because sometimes there's too much detail in the dream. I have to say, during my brief period of remembering dreams, one of the more outrageous things that I discovered is that some of my dreams were actually in Wolfram language code. And they were actually dreams which involved the construction of pieces of code and sort of describing things, not with words, but with code. So that was maybe my brain has been quite distorted by really getting deeply, having written computational language for decades now, and often thinking in terms of it. So that was one of the sort of more bizarre experiences in my brief period of remembering dreams. But I think one of the things that tends to happen is, and one of the reasons that dreams are sort of have been viewed as important for sort of psychological purposes is that, often we have lots of kind of, you couldn't say that in a social setting type things, or you'd never say that, you shouldn't even think that. But in your dreams, you don't have those controls set up. And so the things that, well, I really do think that, are going to come out in your dreams in a way that they wouldn't come out in a more sort of in a more externalized setting. I think so, and again, I'm not the person to ask about dreams because I'm not a person who remembers them, so I don't have the base of experience of all the sort of strange things that happen. I have to say that I don't know whether it's a sign of a personal personality, but in the period I was remembering a bunch of them, they were very benign. I mean, people often talk about how, conflicted dreams seem, and that didn't seem to happen with me, but maybe that's just because I lead too simple a life or something. I don't know. Prutz is commenting, how come we sometimes experience more subjective time in a dream than has actually passed? Does our brain somehow outrun the normal computation rate? That's an interesting question. I mean, again, I don't know how long my dreams have lasted in terms of, I suppose one thinks about something, it took a day or something like that. And even though it obviously didn't take a day because you weren't asleep for a day, it's an interesting question. I mean, what is our marker of time in the awake conscious state? And how does that relate to markers of time when we're not in that state? I suppose it is the case, probably, that the things that are the markings of time, there's a certain intrinsic sense of time elapsing. And I don't know if you kind of are in a sort of sensory deprivation state where you have no external sort of impression of time, can you really tell how much time has elapsed? I think sometimes one can, and sometimes pretty hard to tell. And I think there are probably sort of externalized ways that one detects how much time has passed, even if one's listening to, to speech, listening to music, listening to whatever else. In some sense, one might be counting the words or counting the notes, and that gives one a sense of how much time has elapsed. Or, on a larger scale, it's like you get hungry. You have some sense of how much time has elapsed. Or, the daylight disappears, and you've got some sense of time having elapsed. But I think without those cues, it's not obvious that we have a good way of telling how much time has elapsed? It's an interesting question. When we are just thinking internally our thoughts without outside stimuli, can we really tell how much time has elapsed in thinking those thoughts? Let's see, there's a question from Jeff. What do I think about molecules and supplements that increase synaptic plasticity and control how effectively two neurons communicate? If I look for molecules to boost my brain power. Yeah, you know, the thing about those kinds of hacks, so to speak, is we biological organisms are pretty complicated. And usually the hacks, you know, you're hitting things with a pretty big hammer. Now, you know, sometimes the big hammer is sort of close enough to the mark that it's going to have a good effect. I mean, you know, you might be, I don't know, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I'm a chocolate eater, so maybe it's somewhat the same kind of thing, that, you know, you're feeling kind of tired. Oh, you have you know, that shot of coffee, so to speak, it'll wake you up, or the heavily caffeinated drink or whatever else. And, you know, that's in a sense a big hammer hitting your brain, and yet it does seem to have an effect that is perhaps useful. I mean, you know, whether the great thoughts that you think when you're in a heavily caffeinated state are thoughts that were sort of the right thoughts to think, or whether it was sort of you managed to get your brain to still be awake, but the thoughts you're thinking are really kind of goofy because your brain wasn't really all there, so to speak. I don't know, but one can certainly imagine that there are, you know, it's hard to tell which way those effects would go. If you say, let's do something where we have, you know, the memory potion, so to speak, which lets us remember things better. I don't believe there's any evidence that even in lower organisms, I don't believe there's any evidence of any particular substances that help that. I don't know for sure, but I don't think even in the nematode worm, which is sort of the most studied kind of organism, my friend Sidney Brenner was the one responsible for suggesting that people would decode the nematode worm and figure out how all of its few thousand cells are put together, but it has a little nervous system and it can learn things. And you know, there's sort of a question of, if you feed it the right kind of cabbage, can it increase its rate of learning and so on? And I don't believe there are definitive results on that. I don't believe there's any known sort of potion of increased memory that exists. I mean, there are hacks that are known in terms of things like spaced repetition, for example, where you learn something and then you sort of relearn it again, and then you sort of control the time intervals over which you're relearning the thing. And there are ways to optimize that are known, but that's very externalized relative to kind of the microscopic, you know, let me eat the memory potion type thing. It's you know, it's worth, well, I tend to think that that belief about, you know, probably human memory is fairly complicated in the way that it works, and it's like saying for your computer, let me you know, let me cool down my computer to a lower temperature so that, and sometimes that does work actually, but and sort of change the whole operation of its CPU, and then things will be different. I kind of think that's not such a convincing thing. Let's see, maybe one or two more comments, questions here. There's a question from William here. What is a memory really? Where does one memory start and another end? What is the boundary between the interior and exterior of the mind? Yeah, interesting questions. I mean, we're somewhat used to the idea that you can write down discrete facts, that you can, you know, write down in human language, I saw a bear today, I saw a panda today, whatever else. They're discrete sort of facts. And we have the impression, at least, that our brains are kind of remembering discrete facts, discrete events, and so on. Whether that's really the way it works is not clear. I mean, I think that in the brain, it is very unlikely that one will be able to say, this neuron here is the one that remembered that bear I saw at the zoo. It's not, it doesn't work that way. It'll be some whole combination of neurons and some whole combination and pattern of excitation of those things. We can already see that in artificial neural nets. We can already see that when we have a machine learning system that has all of these connected, all of these things where we just have numbers, and the whole result is some arithmetic combination of all these numbers, and that arithmetic combination ends up saying, for this particular image with this particular arrangement of pixel values, that's a cat or that's a dog. The way that we encode that memory, that sort of knowledge of this is a cat-like picture, this is a dog-like picture, is in terms of just this whole collection of millions, billions of individual numbers that represent the weights, the sort of the intensity with which one neuron affects other neurons and so on. And it's not something where you can say that particular number, that's the cat number or something. That's the thing, that's the little piece of neural circuit that represents cat recognition. That's not the way it seems to work. It's a much more distributed thing. And we can already see that with artificial neural nets, and I'm sure that's how brains work as well. So I think that's, and again, there is probably a level of organization in neuroscience that is above the level of individual synapses and below the level of complete thoughts as we experience them. We don't know what that intermediate level is. And in fact, I don't think that way of thinking about sort of the problem of neuroscience is all that widely understood. But I think that is the key problem of neuroscience, is there a level of description that is above saying what will the individual neurons do and below saying, I thought of a cat type thing. You know, it's not obvious that there will be such a level of description, but there probably will be. And we can already see such a level of description a bit in artificial neural nets, although perhaps not as accurately as we would like. Yeah, I mean, this whole question about what's the boundary between yeah, okay, I see a comment here from Dimitri. Brain does seem to have a bias towards discrete categorization, as in alternating illusions, etc. Yeah, I mean, we want to make decisions. We want to decide, do this or that. We don't want to just sort of fuzz through it. Now, is that the experience of all organisms? I don't know for sure. You know, if we were, I don't know, you know, I would kind of think that, you know, the dolphins, the whales, they probably have that same kind of thought pattern, the cats, the dogs. It's like, you've got two mice. Which one are you going to chase? The left or the right? You're going to make a decision. You're going to chase the left mouse or whatever it is. Left mouse. I think immediately about my left-handed mouse on my computer, but the mouse on the left-hand side of the wall or whatever. But anyway, so, you know, a lot of organisms have this make a decision type of thing. Now, an interesting question is, if you're a different kind of organism, some kind of thing that's some sort of sea creature that's just sort of hanging out and ingesting kind of sort of gradually eating plankton or whatever else, tiny organisms in the oceans or whatever, you know, do you have a similar kind of decision-making tendency, or do you just sort of hang out without making decisions? I mean, I think, you know, when a nautilus shell, for example, which is just this nice spiral shell thing, it just gradually every day, it kind of floats down, it floats up, it floats down, it floats up. I'm not sure it has many decisions to make. I think it just hangs out, and it gradually does what it does. And so its experience of the world might be very different. I mean, it might, you know, when we start saying we make decisions, we have digital yes, no, 1, 0 type things. It's like, what on earth are you talking about? It's, you know, now that imagined conversation is very hard to realize because probably if its conception of the world involves no distinctions, no decisions, then it is probably, you know, then our ability to kind of communicate with it is going to be very challenging, because it's like a lot of what we talk about has the assumption that we're dealing with it's this or that, decisions, distinctions, and so on. And an organism that really doesn't have that, if such a thing exists, it will be very difficult to kind of map its sort of things it's thinking about into the ones that we have. Actually, I'd never thought of that before, but it is interesting to imagine that there might be organisms that just never make a decision in their lives. Well, you know, I would say actually plants might have some of that characteristic. I mean, it's like it just does what it does. It's not making a decision to jump left, jump right. It's sort of gradually growing towards the sun or gradually doing this or whatever. It's not a decision-making kind of life. Yeah, it's an interesting point, though, whether I mean, it may be one of these features of, actually, it's an interesting thought that sort of logic, for example, which is one of our kind of, actually, it's an interesting thought. I mean, you know, what has become clear is that sort of our perception of space, our possibility of doing higher mathematics, these are features of certain assumptions that we have, certain ways that we observe the world. The fact that we believe there's a single thread of existence, a single thread of time, the fact that we have sort of bounded computational abilities. It could be that the concept of logic is a consequence of the fact that our way of viewing the world is a making decisions way of viewing the world, and that we can imagine an organism which doesn't have that, and so wouldn't have a logic, so to speak. You know, what is the logic of the nautilus, or what is the logic of the plant, which sort of never has to make a decision in its life? Interesting question. All right, last thing here, and then I need to go on. I see questions about a lot of different topics. We'll hopefully get to those next week. Commenting that companies into AI like Tesla put a lot of emphasis on vision over other sensory detection. Is that also true for us as human beings? Are some senses more important? Yeah, I mean, we can really tell that because if you just look at the number of nerve fibers that go into your brain from your different sensory organs, it's way different. Like I think the optic nerves have 10 million fibers in them. The auditory nerve, I think, has 50,000 fibers. So that's a big difference. And, you know, there's 10 million fibers versus 50,000 fibers. That means vision is more important than sound to us humans. I think, you know, the olfactory, I don't know how many it is for the olfaction, but I think it's it's in the few thousand range. It's not a large number. Similarly with taste and with touch, same kind of thing. Again, I don't know the numbers offhand. But you can, yes, there's a very concrete way in which you can see which senses are more important for informing our brains. You just look at literally the number of nerve fibers going from our different sensory organs to our brains. I think that the question of the description of the world, you know, we plainly know we have a lot more ways to describe sort of things we see than things we hear and than things we taste or smell. And, you know, for example, I know, you know, we have an image identification system that knows about around 10,000 picturable nouns in English. We have an auditory recognition system that can recognize a bark from a sneeze from whatever else. And I think it only knows about, on the order of 500, different large-scale kinds of things. And I think that that again gives an indication of sound is less capable. Actually, it's an interesting question whether the ratio is so that the ratio for the optic nerve, that must be a factor of let's see, it's a factor of 200 or something between the optic nerve and the auditory nerve. And so in the case of picturable nouns versus sort of audibly identifiable sounds, that would be the named ones. So we're looking there at, let's see, so if we said let's see, 10,100, wow, that almost, well, no, I think that almost works out. That would be about 50 named types of sounds. And it's surprising that that works out. I think that might even work out more or less, that the number of sort of picturable nouns we have. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, because by the time we're talking about picturable nouns, we're talking about much higher level brain function relative to just the number of fibers giving us pixel information from our eyes. But I think that's That's another way to get an indication of sort of the richness of our visual environment versus our auditory environment versus our taste environment, where the number of taste words we have is, you know, sweet, sour, a few other things like that. It's surprisingly few. Well, anyway, I should wrap up here for now today. And well, thanks for lots of interesting questions, and look forward to doing this again next week. So thanks a lot, and bye for now.